Falling Upwards. Lifetimes 3. The following is a story Sadhguru has often related. Around 400 years ago, in the Raigad district, now in Madhya Pradesh, there lived a man named Bilva. He was a tall, strapping young man, fearless and intensely in love with life. He was regarded by his tribe of snake charmers as a strange and unconventional character. He was a Shiva devotee, a rebel, a chronic rule breaker. When he walked, it was with the arrogance of one who regarded the earth as his inheritance. It offended many. They found his intensity disturbing, the majesty of his bearing at odds with his station in life. An archetypal figure, he seemed genetically programmed to be at odds with the world he lived in. He transgressed caste rules by falling in love with a Brahmin girl named Shambhavi. It was a doomed situation. The caste hierarchy of his day was rigid and unforgiving. But Bilva was a man of passion rather than reason. To protect his clan from the repercussions of this forbidden love, he decided to move them to Sambalpur in modern-day Orissa. Apart from reasons of safety, there was also his deep devotion towards the deity of the Mukteshwar temple near that town. The lovers continued their clandestine meetings in the fields and forests that Bilva knew so well. But their liaison could not be kept secret for long. Shambhavi's community soon discovered the truth, and all hell broke loose. The curses and threats did not deter Bilva, however. He started devising strategies of elopement with the woman he loved. He was just 27 years old, a man in the prime of his life, and he knew no fear. Eventually, a group of men from Shambhavi's family, spearheaded by an enraged uncle and aided by the local ruler, laid a trap for the young man. It was a full moon night. The lovers had planned a secret rendezvous in the jungle. Bilva walked unsuspectingly into the trap. Before he knew it, he was surrounded and taken captive. He was tied to a tree, and one of his own snakes let loose on him. The snake venom coursed through the young man's veins. His blood thickened. The pain mounted. His lungs constricted. But determined not to give his tormentors the pleasure of watching him die an ignominious death, Bilva started watching his breath. He watched it as it grew labored, as it came to a final rasping halt. But what should have been a brutal end became a graceful exit. He had left his body in full awareness. That awareness brought him back in his next birth as a spiritual aspirant. His spiritual sadhana was infused with a touch of venom. That venom gave him a fierce edge to his spiritual practice, a near insane urgency which was never to leave him. Shiva Yogi reached high levels of yogic mastery through unrelenting penance. He came from a Telugu-speaking family and traveled widely in his lifetime as an intendant sadhu. In the time-honored tradition of committed seekers in the country, he lived a life of acute hunger and hardship. Much of his time was spent on the mountains of Velangiri, the abode of many legendary seekers of the south. His yogic regimen won him a devoted following. He had at his command a formidable array of psychic powers or siddhis. but he was painfully aware of his own shortcomings. That he was not what people presumed him to be shamed him. He knew he was no more than an impostor until he attained his ultimate goal. Sadhguru describes it as a lifetime of painful, heartbreaking penance. One day, as the yogi sat in meditation in the mountains, a wandering sadhu stopped by his side. This was Sri Palani Swami, a great sage from the hills south of Coimbatore. He owed his name to the fact that he had spent 2.5 years in a state of samadhi in the town of Palani. Since then, he had spent his life wandering the Tamil countryside, bestowing his guidance on many spiritual seekers. Palani Swami immediately recognized the ferocity and anguish of Shiva Yogi's yearning. All that was needed for the next step was the intervention of a guru. The next step, he knew, would be the conclusive one, falling upwards into the unbounded realm of freedom. But Shiva Yogi was a Shiva devotee and a proud man. Knowing he would be unwilling to accept spiritual intervention at the hands of anyone but Shiva, Palani Swami, in his compassion, appeared to him as the Adi Yogi himself. Shiva Yogi surrendered. Palani Swami then raised his staff and placed it on the seeker's forehead. In that moment, Shiva Yogi reached the state he had been in quest of all his life. Enlightenment dawned. The Guru went quietly on his way. Not a word had been uttered between master and disciple. No oaths were taken, no pledges of undying loyalty sworn. They were never to meet after that brief meeting. But Shiva Yogi would never forget the legacy of that encounter. The touch of Palani Swami's staff had freed him. But in its own strange way, it had also bound him. It had brought him to his final destination as a seeker, but it had sown within him a seed that would mark the beginning of his journey as a guru. It conferred upon him a responsibility that would take him lifetimes to fulfill. That seed was the dream of countless yogis before him. It was the recipe to create a sacred form that would liberate not just a spiritual elite, but vast sections of humanity. It was the formula to make freedom available to all. The tale of the Dhyanalinga starts here. While it was an honor to be chosen for this heroic undertaking, it was also a daunting prospect. Others had tried and failed. The Dhyanalinga was a yogic enterprise that seemed historically doomed. Its creation involved the participation of men and women in prolonged, intense spiritual practice, a situation that was always far too unconventional to meet with social comprehension. Tragedy had marked the lives of those who had the temerity to attempt it. But Shiva Yogi's indebtedness to Palani Swami made failure out of the question. He knew that if he did not succeed, he would simply have to start over. Abandoning the mission was not an option. Shiva Yogi's determination to realize his guru's dream failed in his lifetime. He died at the age of 57. The mission, however, endured. In the early part of the 20th century, Shiva Yogi returned. He was now Sadguru Shri Brahma, a South Indian mystic, also from a Telugu-speaking family, famed for his abrasive manner and extravagant compassion. Numerous ashrams across southern India still stand as testimony to the devotion of the common man for this irascible but strangely lovable mystic. At one point, when he lived at the ashram in Coonoor, still to be found in front of a well-known cordite factory, Sadhguru insisted on flouting British Raj restrictions that prohibited people from crossing the tracks at the nearby railway station. The rules were particularly stringent during Second World War, but that did not deter him. When he was arrested for his offense, he simply walked out through the prison gates and strode back to his ashram. Nothing much could be done after that. Word spread, and the Nilgiris region was soon filled with his staunchest disciples. On another occasion, a crowd that had gathered to hear him speak near the Uti lake was agitated by some of his outspoken comments. Generous with his abuse, which was directed as freely at the gods as at those around him, Sadguru Shri Brahma was often perceived as an arrogant and ungodly man. When the situation seemed on the verge of erupting into violence, Sadhguru paused and asked an 11-year-old boy in the crowd to step forward. He placed a hand on the boy's head and bade him walk on the lake. The boy proceeded to do just that. The simmering crowd fell suddenly quiet. Sadhguru was known to perform this kind of flamboyant miracle, however, only in extreme situations. Sadguru Shri Brahma did his best to establish the Dhyanalinga, but social opposition to his spiritual process was considerable. What was this peculiar yogic practice that involved the involvement of men and women in conditions of intense proximity? The notion offended some of the most fiercely guarded norms of South Indian orthodoxy. Sadhguru was hounded out of Coimbatore. In a fury, the yogi walked for days on end. For his faithful disciple Vibhuti, keeping pace with him was not easy. What made things even more difficult was procuring provisions from the locals of the villages they passed, cooking a meal, and hastening to his master's side before he moved on. It meant waiting until his master was in deep meditation, and then surreptitiously placing the meal in front of him. The disciple would then go into hiding, and from a safe distance watch his master eat his food. More overt intervention would have further incensed Sadhguru, who was already in an inflamed state. The Guru and the disciple walked on at a relentless pace. Eventually they reached Kurapa in modern-day Andhra Pradesh. Here they settled down in a small temple of Someshwar, dedicated to the intoxicating form of Shiva. The temple priest and other officials beat a hasty retreat, unable to bear the scorching intensity of their presence. There was a reason for choosing this temple. Sri Palaniswami had been here in his lifetime. For the next 6 months, in this nondescript little temple in a dusty town of Kadapa, a plot was hatched by Guru and disciple. It was a plot that decided the future destiny of more than 24 people, right down to the family and the specific womb in which they were to be born, the skills they would acquire, the kind of lives they would lead. It was an attempt to create a future environment that would be congenial to the creation of the Dhyanalinga. The hurdle that had prevented the Dhyanalinga from reaching fruition right through history was social. Yogis of virtuosity had been thwarted by the rigidity of prevalent norms. In a shrewd, tactical move, Sadhguru decided to place some of his trusted disciples in the families from which he anticipated the most hostility. The rationale? Being implicated, they would find it difficult to foil his plans. But one thing was clear: opposition was inevitable. The creation of the Dhyanalinga would always meet with bitter adversaries. The stage was now set for the final act. Scripted with attention to infinitesimal detail, the next performance had to be the clincher. But before the great plot was swung into action, Sadhguru made one more attempt to accomplish his aim. He chose the body of a Bala yogi, or child saint, Sadhananda, in an ashram at Vajeshwari in western India. Having attained enlightenment at the age of 11, Sadhananda had spent 3 odd years in a samadhi state and had shed his body at the age of 26. Though he now had a plan in place, when Sadhguru saw this alternative opportunity in the form of a carefully prepared body, he grabbed it. For a few months he inhabited 2 bodies. He knew his lifespan was limited, and he worked intensely to create a few disciples who could fulfill his mission. But he was disappointed. The situation he found in Vajeshwari was no more conducive to the creation of the Dhyanalinga than the one in Coimbatore. He shed the Bala yogi's body, reverted to his own, and prepared for his own departure. Another lifetime had failed. It looked like Palaniswami's dream was to remain just that, an enormous possibility that the world was just not ready to embrace. Sadhguru now returned to the Velangiri mountains. He ascended the 7th hill, the wild and wind-swept landscape of which still says much about the man who chose it as the site of his final departure. Here he left his body through all 7 chakras, the mark of a Chakreshwara, a yogi of rare accomplishment, his precursor being none other than Shiva, the first recorded yogi in the history of mankind. But before his spectacular exit at the age of 42, Sadguru Shri Brahma made a declaration: "I will be back